it's Josiah here, and today we're reading Walk Two Moons, Chapter 6, Blackberries. Let's begin. What was the diabolical thing that happened to Mr. Cadaver? Graham says. You didn't tell us that yet. I explained that just as Phoebe was going to divulge the purely awful thing that happened to Mr. Cadaver, her father came home from work, and we all sat down to dinner. Me, Phoebe, Mr. and Mrs. Winterbottom, and Phoebe's sister, Prudence. Phoebe's parents reminded me a lot of my other grandparents. The Pickforce, like the Pickforce, Mr. and Mrs. Winterbottom spoke quickly in short sentences and sat straight up as they ate their food. They were extremely polite to each other, saying, "Yes, Norma," and "Yes, George," and "Would you please pass the potatoes, Phoebe?" and "Wouldn't your guests like another helping?" They were picky about their food, too. Everything they ate was what my father would call side dishes. Potatoes, carrots, bean salad, and a Mr. Casserole that I could not identify. They did not eat meat. They did not use butter. They were very much concerned with cholesterol. From what I could gather, Mr. and Mr. Winterbottom worked in an office creating road maps. Mrs. Winterbottom baked and cleaned and did laundry and grocery shopping. I had a funny feeling that Mrs. Winterbottom did not actually like all this barking and cleaning and laundry and shopping, and I'm not quite sure why I had that feeling, because if you just listened to the words she said, it sounded as if she was Mrs. Supreme Housewife. For example, at one point, Mrs. Winterbottom said, "I believe I've made more pies in the past week than I can count," she said in her cheery voice. But afterwards, in this small silence, there was no commented on all these pies. She had been busy making. She gave a soft sigh and looked down at her plate. A little later, she said, "I couldn't find exactly the brand of moose-eye you like so much, George. But I brought something similar." "Oh," Mr. Winterbottom said. "I'm sure it's quite similar to what you wanted." Mr. Winterbottom kept eating again and again, and in that silence, Mrs. Winterbottom gave a soft sigh and examined her plate. I was sort of happy for her when she announced that since Phoebe and Prudence were back in school, she thought she would return to work. Apparently, during the school term, she worked part-time at Rocky's Rubber as a receptionist. I thought this might be a nice change for her, to be out of the house, but when she mentioned going back to work and no one said anything about it, she sighed again and pushed her potatoes to one side of her plate. A few times, Mrs. Winterbottom called her husband Sweetie Pie and Honey Bun, she said. "Would you like more carrots, Sweetie Pie? And did you make enough potatoes, Honey Bun?" For some reason, that surprised me. Those little names she used. She was dressed in a plain brown skirt and a white blouse. On her feet were sensible wide, flat shoes. She did not wear makeup, even though she had a pleasant round face and long yellow curls. The main impression I got was that she was used to being plain and ordinary, and that she was not supposed to do anything too shocking. Another odd impression I got was that Mr. Winterbottom was playing the role of father, with a capital F. He sat at the head of the table with his white shirt cuffs rolled back neatly. He still wore his red and blue striped tie. He kept his face very serious throughout the entire meal. His voice was deep, and his words were clear. "Yes, Norma," he said, deeply and clearly. "No, Norma." He looked more like 52 than 38, but this was not something I would ever call to his or Phoebe's attention. Phoebe's sister, Prudence, was quite a bit like her mother. Prudence was 17 years old, but she acted like she was almost a mother herself. She ate primly, she nodded politely, and smiled a small, polite smile after everything she said. It all seemed peculiar. They acted so thumpingly tidy and respectful. At the end of the dinner, Mrs. Winterbottom brought in the blackberry pie and ate it, even though the blackberries did not have as much flavor as they did in Bibank, Kentucky. Mrs. Winterbottom asked Phoebe who was in her class at school. She started naming everyone, and when she got to Mary Lou Finney, Mr. Winterbottom said, "Finney? Finney?" He turned to Mrs. Winterbottom. "Norma, is Mr. Finney the one who wears blue jeans, when he was always throwing that football?" "Yes, George." To Phoebe, he said, "Is Mary Lou the one who goes around saying, on point it?" Phoebe said, "Yes." Mr. Winterbottom said, "I suppose they don't seem They probably don't seem. They probably appear. I suppose they probably don't seem. They probably appear a bit odd. Mr. Winterbottom said, "Norma, I wouldn't want to judge, but he was judging. I could tell. He was like the Finneys. He didn't like the Finneys, or maybe he was jealous of them." Mrs. Winterbottom gave her soft sigh and folded her napkin. I had a feeling that there was something she really wanted to say, but she had already decided that no one would listen. After dinner, Phoebe walked me home, and on the way, she talked about Mrs. Cadaver. She said, "You wouldn't think it to look at her, but Mrs. Cadaver is as strong as an ox." "How do you know that?" I said. Phoebe looked behind her, as if she was expecting someone to be following us. "Because," she said, "I have seen her chop down trees and lug the remains clear across her backyard. Do you know what happened? What I think happened? I think she killed Mr. Cadaver and chopped him up and buried him in her yard." "Phoebe," I said. "Well, I'm just telling you what I think, that's all." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Mrs. Cadaver, and I wanted to believe that she was capable of killing her husband and chopping him into pieces, burying him in the backyard. And then I started thinking about blackberries and about how spoiled I was by the blackberries in Bybanks. I had a vision of my mother and me walking round the rims of the fields and pastures, picking blackberries all summer, just as we used to. We filled our pockets with blackberries, but we did not pick from the bottom of the vine, or the top ones. The ones at the bottom were for the rabbits, my mother said, and the top ones were for the birds. The ones at people height were for people. Laying in bed, remembering those blackberries, made me think of something else, too. It was something that had happened a couple years ago, on a morning when my mother slept late. It was that time she was pregnant. My father and I had already eaten breakfast, and she was out in the fields. On the table, my father had a single flower in each of 2 juice glasses, a black-eyed suntan in front of my place, and a white petunia in front of my mother's. My father must have gone out to the field and picked them as soon as he had awakened. When my mother came into the kitchen that day, she saw the flowers immediately. "Oh," she said, "glory!" She bent her face toward each flower. She looked out the window and said, Let's go find him." We climbed the hill to the barn, crawled between the fence wires, and crossed the field. My father was standing at the far end of the field, his back to us, hands on his hips, looking at the section of fence. My mother slowed down when she saw him. I was right behind her. It looked as if she wanted to creep up and surprise him, so I went quiet, too, and cautious in my steps. I could hardly keep from giggling. It seemed so daring to be sneaking up on my father. He was sure my mother was going to throw her arms around him and kiss him and hug him, and tell him how lovely the flowers on the kitchen table. My mother had always loved anything that normally grows or lives outdoors. Anything. Lizards, trees, cows, caterpillars, birds, flowers, grasshoppers, crickets, toads, dandelions, ants, pigs. Just before we reached my father, he turned around. Maybe he heard us. This seemed to surprise my mother and throw her off guard. She stopped. "Sugar?" he said. My mother opened her mouth, and I was thinking, "Come on, throw your arms around him. Tell him." But before she could speak, my father pointed to the fence and said, "Look at that, a morning's work." He indicated a new length of wire strung between our new posts. There was sweat on his face and arms. And then I saw my mother was crying. My father saw it too. "What?" he said. He stepped toward her and said, "Oh, you're too good, John. You're too good. All you hiddles are too good. I'll never be so good. I'll never be able to think of all the things I can never do like you." My father looked down at me. "The flowers," I said. "Oh," he said. He put his sweaty arms around her, but she was still crying, and it wasn't what I had imagined it would be. It was all sad instead of happy. The next morning, when I went into the kitchen, my father was standing beside the table. He was looking at the 2 small dishes of blackberries, so shiny and wet would do. One dish at his place and one at mine. "Thank you," I said. "No, it wasn't me," he said. "It was your mother." Just then she came in from the back porch. My father put his arms around her, and they smooched, and it was all tremendously romantic. And I started to turn away, but my mother caught my arm. She pulled me to her and said to me, and said to me, though it was meant for my father, I think, see, I'm almost as good as your father. She said it in a shy way, laughing a little. I felt betrayed, but I didn't know why. After that dinner at Phoebe's, where we had the blackberry pie, I started wondering about all of this. I had been part of my mother, where she was me and I was her, more than I was part of my father. So anything that was true of her was true of me. It was as if she had said, we're almost as good as your father." And I wanted to say, "We're as good as, we're better." But why I wanted to say this, I don't know. I love my father. It was surprising, all the things you remember just by eating a blackberry pie. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys did, to leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next video.